Hi everyone. In this session, I will cover sun study animations and creating 3D walkthroughs. In Chief Architect X17, a new stationary tool is available you can use to create sun studies with a time-lapse view or with a seasonal view. And while 3D walkthroughs are not new to X17, there have been new features introduced you can use in producing your walkthroughs that will also be covered in this session. Let's begin with the stationary walkthrough that can be used to create your sun studies by first looking at the two different ways you can create these, either with a time-lapse or seasonal. In this time-lapse video, there's a begin time and an end time. You'll see it in the upper left-hand corner as the sun moves across the sky towards evening. In the seasonal time-lapse, this is at the same time every day, in this case 10 a.m. You can see the effects of the sun each day throughout that period of the year. Let's take a look at the process to create your stationary walkthrough. First of all, make sure you've placed your north pointer. Then we're going to need a sun angle, and you'll need two of these, one for a start time and one for an end time. In the sample plan, I'll go down there in a minute, on floor 0 is where I put my terrain, and I've also put my sun information on that level. The second thing is you're going to want to start from a 3D camera that you've already created. You've defined the lighting, the sunlight, etc., and you're very happy with that camera. Then we'll define the style as a time-lapse or seasonal. We'll set the time duration. How long do you want it to run? Maybe 15 seconds, maybe longer. And then when you get ready to record it, how many frames per second? Typically 30 is a good number. If you want higher fidelity, you can go up to 60. And then finally the resolution you record it in. I typically will record mine in the 1920 by 1080. So let me first go to floor 0. On floor 0, you can see my house structure. You see one of the shadows is created, and then you see my sun angles. Let's zoom in and take a look at the sun angles. I've color-coded my sun angles. This is just something I do. When I color-code them, I do it in a way that is also with reference to the color of the shadow that's created. In this case, my sun shadow is a light gray, so that's why you're seeing the gray information. Let me just show you the process to create a sun angle. I'll color code it, and that way you'll know how these are done. I typically will create at least 4 of these in my plan, maybe a couple for the short day of the year and a couple for the long day of the year. So for the winter side, I've got one here for early December, and it's set at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. Let's assume that I want one for somewhere around the noon time. So I'm going to come up underneath the CAD menu, and there is an option down here for sun angle. I'll just click once. The program will then open up the dialog, and you can fill out the information. Let's go ahead and set this to be December 21st, and I want to set this to be at noon. And then on the line style and the fill style, I'm going to set that to be blue. So on the line style, I'm going to override the layer color. We'll pick a blue out of the selection box. I'm going to do the exact same thing. The fill style is what's going to create the 2D shadow. So I'm going to select the exact same blue that I've used, and now I've created a new sun angle. You can move these around as you want. I've kind of organized mine between summer and winter, and as I scroll out a little bit, I put my terrain on level 0. I've done that because I have a walkout basement, and it made the most sense to put that there. The sun shadow is being generated in gray for summer. When I click on the winter shadow and I come down and I use the tool Make Shadow, you can see the projection. It's very different than the summer shadow, and you can also see that it's using the blue color, and that's why I go through and color code those, because it's very obvious if I want to create multiple 2D shadows which one is which. Well, let's return back up to floor 1. Alright, so I have a north pointer, I have a couple of sun angles, and I want to start from a 3D camera view that's already been created, and it's dialed in with all of the lighting information. I've already have that camera open. You can see it down below down here. I'm going to switch over to that panel where the camera is open. to get to the stationary walkthrough, there's a few ways you can do it. The first way is through the menu system. Underneath 3D walkthroughs is an option to create a stationary walkthrough. I've also added this as a custom toolbar. You can see that in my toolbar over here. I've customized it. I've added that tool, and then in your floor plan view, if you click on the camera, you'll see it in your Edit Toolbar button in the bottom section of the menu. Let's go through on the walkthrough and take a look at the stationary walkthrough dialog. And I'm just going to walk through this from the top to the bottom. At the beginning of the dialog is your resolution. Here's a couple of canned resolutions. The higher the resolution, the longer it will take to generate, the higher quality. Again, I typically do mine at 1920. There are several options. Plus, you can also customize it, and you can uncheck Retain Aspect Ratio if you want something very specific and uniquely shaped. There's a compression setting if you want to condense it. I don't like to have any compression put on mine. I typically will leave that at 0. The duration is the amount of time the animation will take place. In this case, I have it at 15 seconds. This is subjective, so depending on how you want that set up is where you put in the duration. Frames per second. My recommendation is usually at 30 frames per second. If you want a higher fidelity, then you can go up to 60 frames per second, and it's very crisp. The higher frames per second, the higher quality, the longer it takes. Next is your video codec. I'm using a Windows system. There's a few codecs built in. I typically use the H.264, and I believe Mac also has that same codec. Next is for the sun interpolation information, time-lapse or seasonal. Again, to just kind of review, time-lapse is where the sun comes up in the morning, sun sets in the evening, the sun's going to go across the sky, and you're going to see the effects of it. Seasonal is typically going to be at the exact same day for a period of time. In my example I showed earlier, that was at 10 a.m. for an entire year, and you could see the effect of where the sun was each day of the year. And in fact, let me change that over to seasonal, and let's take a look at the start sun angle information. You can see I have a sun angle at 10 a.m., and let's drop that down. These are all the available sun angles that I have in the plan. You can create a new one, you can edit, you can delete them with the toolbars over here. For this one, it's at 10 a.m., July 4th. The year is 2025. If I want this to be seasonal and have it at the same day throughout the year, that means I need a sun angle that would be a year from now. So I'm going to come down and I'm going to choose the one that is at 10 a.m. Let's drop that back down. 10 a.m. and that's a year in advance. Okay, so then down below is information, how many frames it's going to record. Since we're doing the duration at 15 and we're going to be doing 30 frames per second, it gives you the information. Save to disk, you browse out, you can put it on your disk. I typically would put this in the clients folder underneath their projects under walkthroughs. Go ahead and click the save option, and then the next option is to save this to your Chief Cloud account. This will put it in your Chief Cloud account, and from your cloud that's included with your software subscription, then you can use that link and share it with your customers. You can also embed it on your website. So that is where you'd put it on your cloud. Again, give it a name. If you're replacing it, if you've recorded it a couple times and you need to replace it, here's where you can choose that option, and then you give it a description. Once I click OK, the program's going to go through and compile each one of these frames. This one's a little more intensive. I have line drawing on, I have animated water turned on, and those things are going to add to the time amount. Also, it's a function of your video card, and it may take a while to generate these, so just be sensitive to the fact that some of these may take a little bit longer to run. You might kick it off in the evening or at a lunch break, that sort of thing, and then you can generate your time-lapse walkthrough. As I wrap up this session, I'll show you a couple of time lapses. Here's one from a kitchen scene. So standing at the kitchen island, you can see the effects as we look out over the living room where the sun is at approximately 6 p.m. and then goes into the evening. I believe it's at 9:30 p.m. As I switch gears and move into the bathroom, same setup. I've got the camera dialed in. We're looking towards the window. Camera is set initially at 6 p.m. for the time lapse, and then as the sun fades down to 9:30, you can see the effects. These are nice videos to be able to show a client how the sun may change in the view depending on what the time of day is. So have fun creating your seasonal or time-lapse stationary walkthroughs using the tool from a 3D view. Let's switch topics and now talk about 3D walkthroughs. Several of the settings we just reviewed from the stationary walkthrough are also applicable for walkthrough paths. In this session, I'll provide a brief overview of how to create a 3D walkthrough path and then spend most of the time looking at existing walkthrough paths from our sample plans and how you can accomplish similar results. If you're looking for more of the how-tos in creating a 3D walkthrough, we have a separate video that covers the process in more detail. Let me first start with the process of creating a 3D walkthrough path. There are a few ways you can do this, and the first way is from the option in the 3D menu. From this menu, you can choose to create a 3D walkthrough path. I'll just create a simple walkthrough path that starts at the entry door here. I'm going to click and drag with my left mouse button, release, click and drag with my left mouse button, and release, and that's going to end the path. And to get out of the creation mode, I'll press the space bar. You see my cursor change to an arrow. Now this has created a keyframe, 1, 2, and 3, each time that I've clicked and dragged the mouse. These keyframes, you can click on them and orient the view toward the point of interest you're interested in. There's a diamond here. You can click and drag those towards the point of interest. And the easiest way to position your cameras is to use the Preview Walkthrough tool. You'll find that in the lower Edit toolbar. It's called Walkthrough Preview. The Walkthrough Preview is a little bit more taxing on your system. However, it will allow you to dial in the exact views for each of these cameras. On keyframe number 1, I come up and you can see how I can actually move the camera. I can dolly it around. This works on the keyframe. If you use the scrubber tool, this little green arrow down in here, and I move that, I actually can't move in between the different keyframes. So I need to be on a keyframe. Let's double click on keyframe number 2 here. And notice how I get the framing of the scene in with the outside definition, and then my camera changes to the dolly. I can adjust that camera, and again, double click on keyframe number 3. I get the outline surrounding the scene. My camera changes to a dolly, and I can make the adjustment. Each one of the keyframes has information about the height and the floor and the time, the angle, and this information can be adjusted on a per keyframe basis. We've been adjusting the camera and tilt angle. If I want to adjust the height, come in here and I'll make this adjustment. Let's set it to 84 inches. Based on that height adjustment, I may want to take the camera and tilt it down so the point of interest in the island is visible in the scene. Now, if I move back to keyframe number 2 by double clicking, this camera is set at a height of 60 inches and keyframe number 3 was set to 84 inches. As the scene moves along, and let's just use the scrubber bar here and let's move along the current frame. So what's going to happen is the camera is going to raise in height between frame 2 and 3 over the course of about 24 inches. It will move the camera in a linear fashion in between those two keyframes. In between each of the keyframes, notice that between keyframe number 2 and number 3, there is a speed after the camera. For each of your cameras, with the exception of the very last frame, you can control the speed after your camera. So if you want to slow something down, speed something up, you can do that in between these keyframes. If I have a curve, you notice that this curve comes around in my plan view. I may want to slow that down between keyframe 1 and 2. As I go back to keyframe number 1, And I'll come into the speed. I may want to slow that down to be quite slow, and the speed between keyframe number 1 and number 2 would be at 1 foot per second, so quite slow. A lot of times I will record the walkthroughs slower, and then I may speed them up in post-processing and with an external video editor. Keyframes can be group selected. If I want to hold my shift key down and select both frame 1 and 2, I could come in, make the adjustment on the height. I'll set those both to 84 inches. Anytime you want to make a similar change between your keyframes, group selecting them can be an easier process to do that. Let's select keyframe number 1. The sun angle was defaulted to 10 a.m. on July 4th. If I want to make an adjustment on the sunlight, I have the option of using a generic sun or any of the sun angles that I've already created in the plan. I can use those sun angles. You can also use different sun angles per keyframe, and as I move to keyframe number 2, the sunlight is being derived from keyframe number 1, so it's going to inherit the sunlight information for both keyframe 2 and 3. If you want to change those in between, I'll show you a scene that I've done that to create a sunset effect. That can be a useful process. Now in keyframe number 3, one of the features that I like to do is pause on this final frame. To do that, there's an option down here for this keyframe number 3 to use the pause keyframe. I can enter in the pause duration, so if I change that to maybe 2 seconds, the recording will then pause that last frame for a couple of seconds. That allows the viewer to focus on the final frame. Notice the indentation of that keyframe in here, start and end. And again, this is just a nice feature to be able to focus on your final frame so the video just doesn't abruptly end. Now let's take a look at the Define option toward the top of the Preview panel. On the General panel, this information is inherited from the keyframes and the walkthrough path as well as your walkthrough defaults. I'll open up those defaults in a minute. The information on each of the cameras repeated that you already have in the preview, as well as the sun information, the keyframe size, which is in your floor plan view, how big you want these keyframes, some of the height information. Sometimes you want to set your camera heights absolute or relative depending on how your terrain is. There is the ability to do sun interpolation. If you want to change the sun angle information, right now I have all the same sun. When I open up one of the samples, I've changed that. The sun interpolation can be changed from a time-lapse mode interpolation to a seasonal, and then there's an option to overlay the sun information, timestamp, the resolution of your video, and then it gives you some stats on the duration and how many frames per second. On the cameras, similar information that you may have in your typical camera settings, you can choose the rendering techniques. I will show you where I've recorded in all of the different rendering techniques, and as you go into the Define option for your camera, you have the same type of settings for rendering. If you want to record a standard walkthrough and put hand-drawn lines on top, then you can define exactly what the fidelity is for those lines. We cancel out of this. There are settings if you want to include shadows, reflections, those are for mirrors. If you want to animate water, good for an outdoor scene, maybe if you have a swimming pool, and then your lighting information. Typically I always recommend you use a light set. I've got a number of light sets. Since I'm doing a kitchen, I would change the light set. Again, you typically want to set this up exactly the same way as you do with a render camera, and I'll show you how to generate a render camera. There's an option over here I use to generate a render camera. Then I dial that in and then apply those settings inside of the camera scene. Backdrop, if you're going to be creating a walkthrough, I would either use a generated sky. That will be a panoramic view and rotate with the camera. If you're going to be using your own backdrop, make sure that you use a spherical backdrop. I've seen walkthroughs where the backdrop does not rotate properly and it looks a little confusing and maybe isn't the best view. And if you don't have one and you don't like the generated sky, simply just don't use a backdrop. It can be white or blue outside of the windows. A few other settings for the walkthrough panels. I'll skip over those for now. As I mentioned, when you're creating your walkthrough, you want to dial in all of your render settings. You can click on these keyframes, and right now I'm on keyframe number 3. You see the preview up here, and if I use the tool, I'll mouse over this here so you can see it, create a camera view from the current preview frame. Let me go ahead and click on that. The camera view is created. It matches the scene. You see the preview panel, you see the 3D scene, and now I can go in and modify this scene and then transfer any information that I find valuable in here underneath the tool called Edit Active View. Let's just make a couple of adjustments in here. Let's change the camera to the physically based. Then I'm going to use the Adjust Sunlight, and then I'm going to choose a specific sun angle. We'll use the July 4th at 10 a.m. And then finally, I'm going to adjust the lights. And in the Adjust Lights dialog, I like to use light sets. It specifically forces the program to turn on specific lights. I do it by room. When I click the drop down, you can see that I have a kitchen living light set. I'll sort that based on what's on. So you can kind of see as I scroll down that most of the lights that are turned on are in the room of interest, the kitchen, the living room, the wine room. And then once I've made those settings, let me close this preview, select a defaults. Let's let the program rebuild and generate the view. This will take just a second. We'll give it a second to denoise the view. And now I see what the scene would look like. This is in a physically based mode. I can also toggle on hand-drawn lines. Let me use the shortcut tool over here on the left-hand side. So when I set up my 3D walkthroughs, I will usually generate a 3D camera. And then I can take this camera and rotate around. I can look at it, I can look at the sun information and make sure that all of the settings that I want look good in a typical 3D view, and then I can open up my 3D walkthrough, usually on keyframe number 1, and make those same settings. So that's the typical process that I would go through in creating a 3D walkthrough path. Let me switch gears. Let me close these views up here. Now before we reverse engineer and pick apart a few different walkthroughs that have been created in the sample plans, I'm going to show you a different way to create a walkthrough path. This one was created right out of the 3D menu. I'm going to click on this and delete it. I find sometimes in creating a walkthrough path, I like to just do it with a CAD line tool. Using the line tool, I'm going to come in, I'm going to click and drag to create segment number 1, segment number 2, and segment number 3. I'm going to take this middle segment and I'm going to create an arc out of it. And then there's a Make Tangent tool. Let's go ahead and make it tangent. And now I have a perfect arc. I can convert that into a walkthrough path and put the keyframes on it. When I click on the line, there's a tool in my bottom edit menu, Convert Polyline. And as I scroll down toward the bottom of it, there is the option to convert it into a walkthrough path. And then I can go in and make some adjustments into the default settings for the walkthrough path. I'll go ahead and accept the default settings here. And now I have a walkthrough path created. Again, the same type of editing. If you need to add another keyframe in here, while the path is selected, there's a tool in the lower edit menu, add keyframe, and then go into the preview panel and make the same adjustments. And I find this a little bit easier sometimes than creating a walkthrough spline where I can kind of explicitly draw the lines myself. Let's look at one final way. As I zoom out, you see that I have a circle all the way around the structure. Just pull that down just a little bit so we see it. So this is a 360 view that will go all the way around the house. And one of the things that I will typically do is if I take a 3D view, and we'll just kind of come in here, point and click, and you see that I'm outside the perimeter of the house a bit. As I move back over into the floor plan view, one of the tools that I like to do, let's click on the camera itself. One of those tools is to create and I'll mouse over this so you can see what it says, create an orbital path, and that's going to create a 360 path that will surround the structure. And what I might do before I do that is I like to maybe point that right into the centroid of the structure, and then when I use this tool that is create an orbital path, you can see that get generated. It's very close to the other one that I had since it's outside the perimeter of the house itself. And now the camera will follow all the way around that path. Right next to that camera was a tool we may have used in a previous segment here, and that's called Create a Stationary Walkthrough. And that will allow you to see the scene for a seasonal or a time lapse. You can also animate the water. So those are the main ways of creating your walkthrough paths. Now let me switch gears a little bit. Let's take a look at some of the existing walkthrough paths, and we'll discuss some of the tips that we can use in creating these walkthrough paths. I want to share a few tips with you before we open up and look at these videos. Make sure you place a north pointer in your plan. Also set your sun angle. It's going to give you a little bit more realistic view. I'm using a sample plan here called the Hawk's Nest. If you go down to floor 0 and I scroll down here, you can see that I've created a north pointer and my sun angles. I've created a handful of those. These are important. I put these on floor 0. That's where my landscape is. I've got a swimming pool down there, so it's walkout, so it made the most sense to put those on floor 0. Consider defining a layer set that you can use for walkthroughs. I try to have all my accessories turned on, some of the vehicles, so I know where the points of interest are that I want to go around. I can also isolate so there isn't a bunch of noise in here. So I use a layer set. Notice that I'm using a saved plan view called walkthrough, and if I open up my layer display settings, it's using a layer set called walkthrough. So it kind of is a clean looking view for those things. We already looked at using the preview to adjust your walkthroughs. It's a little bit more time consuming to use that preview, but it really makes a difference. When you're going to record your walkthrough, 30 frames per second. 60 is going to give you higher fidelity. I mentioned using a panoramic backdrop or maybe the generated sky, so your backdrops move seamlessly as you turn corners. When you have an angle in your walkthrough path, let's just kind of zoom in here and take a look here. You can see that I've got one that's got quite an angle in here. Anytime you're turning a corner, let's zoom in a little bit closer. I've got quite a few keyframes in here. When you're going to be turning those corners, slow your camera speeds down. And my recommendation on that is maybe slow it down to 0.25 feet per second. And to put that in context, a lot of people may walk, if you're kind of walking down a hallway in a brisk form, that's maybe 4 feet per second. I've got that orbital walkthrough. I'm probably going to go at 12 feet per second. And I want it to go pretty quick, but it's also at a very far perimeter from the structure itself. When you create a walkthrough path, and let's say you have a whole house, one of the things that I do is I use small walkthrough paths and stitch it together with an external video software. I try to avoid having one large walkthrough path. They're time consuming to record, and also if you find making edits to it, it can just be time consuming. So I usually create small walkthrough paths. You see I have a bathroom, a closet. I will create a walkthrough video outside of Chief Architect by stitching those together. So underneath the default settings, let's look at some of the walkthrough properties in here. Again, this will, anytime you create a walkthrough path, it will use this information. So your keyframe size, your sun angles, sun interpolation, the resolution size, frames per second, your video codec. I typically use the default there. What's your default camera? Mine's the standard. You want animated water turned on, your backdrop information, and then a few other things. So if you want to make those changes in your default every time you create a walkthrough path, it will then use those properties. Zoom in and let's look at a few of these walkthrough paths that I have. I've got one that comes in the kitchen, and you can see how it comes in the entry door, looks at the island, comes around, and then I've got a number of cameras right in here that peek at the sink and then come back out and look outside the window. Let's play that, and then we'll open up the keyframes and talk about it a little bit. So that walkthrough took into effect 8 different frames. You can see that in the floor plan view as well as in the preview panel. And on the final frame, you notice that how the sun sat. Looked in another session about creating sun studies. You can do the exact same thing in your walkthroughs. So as we kind of look at keyframe number 1, this is using the sun angle at 6 p.m. And then that same sun angle is going to be used all the way through keyframe number 7. And then on keyframe number 8, you're going to see that it's going to be doing an interpolation. And as I look at the final frame, because this is being paused, and then the sun information is at 9:30 p.m. So that means it's going to interpolate the sun in a time-lapse mode from 6 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. and you get the effect of that sun moving, and that's kind of a interesting effect. And then as we went around the sync, come into keyframe number 5, 6, and there's a pause in here. See, this is a pause, and it paused it for just 1 second. Those are all the different effects and using it as we've talked about in the session so far. Now as I kind of scroll out and we look at another one, I've got a kitchen approach, and I'll highlight this. And there's really kind of 3 segments in here. The kitchen approach, the rear of the island, and then the front of the island. And I've recorded these in each one of the different camera styles. This is a different way than the spline that I've created circling around it. This allows you to kind of focus on the things. And I'm going to play the different recordings and we'll kind of buzz through these a little bit, but it'll give you an idea how the different rendering techniques, remember you just go into the define option, and then on the cameras, you change them to be each one of the cameras. So take a look at these and let's come back on after we've played through those. It really depends on the style you like. Maybe you had a favorite there. As I open up the camera, I wanted to just point you to a couple of things when I recorded those. When you're going to be recording with a physically based ray trace, or for that matter the clay, they take longer. And that's because it's calculating a lot more light data. For the physically based, also when you go in and you hit the define option, if you use hand-drawn lines on top, it adds a little bit more edges and it takes longer to do. When I switch over to the clay view, one of the things that I did was you can use the layer color. So the camera has layers and then you can set up the layers based on the camera. And if you're curious about how that works, you could download the Hawk's Nest sample plan. There's a layer set called Z Camera, and all it is a couple of layers that are just a little bit different, and then you can use the layer color for the clay camera, and then again the drawn lines on top, especially in the clay view, I think add a nice little edge. Well, that's all I've got for the session. Thanks for watching, and hope you create some great 3D walkthroughs.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for taking my question. Can you hear me okay?
We can. Where are you calling from, Bonnie?
Okay. I'm calling in from Florida.
Okay.
So I have 2 questions. One, you mentioned that when you were doing your 3D walkthroughs, that you said to create small walkthroughs. I found in the past that when I created large ones, they took hours to compile. So
Yeah.
you mentioned that you were doing small ones and then you were stitching them together with a third-party software, it sounded like. I'm just
Right.
wondering what tool you're using to do that.
Sure. I kind of just, let me just open up, I'll show you the example. So I've got an example here where I have a bedroom, and then the bedroom transitions into a closet, and then that also then transitions into a bathroom. So
Right.
those are 3 distinct walkthrough paths. So I record those each separately. They're not very big, so it allows me to get a result pretty quickly. And then there's a number of tools that you can use. I think on the PC, Windows includes Movie Maker. And then there's also a equivalent of that on the Mac. And then there's a couple of third-party tools, some that go, from free to, pretty expensive. I use one I think I paid maybe $50 for from Camtasia. And I just basically drop those into a timeline, and then I'll do a transition in between the two. Let me see if I have that open here real quick. So when I do those transitions, let's see here. There we go. Yeah, here's that walkthrough. It's a little bit chunky when I play this live, but let me just kind of scrub through this. And so, here's the bedroom right here as I'm kind of pausing. and then there's going to be a transition. So that immediately goes into the closet. And so I just fade that, peek around in the closet, and then I do a fade and peek into the bathroom. And I just find using those simple little walkthrough paths is a little bit easier for me to manage because, it's a pretty big house. If I were to try to figure out how to have a camera navigate through there, gosh, it may take me a long time to troubleshoot it.
Yeah.
How?
Yeah. I had tried that and it took and again, part of it could have been my computer at the time, but it took
Yeah,
hours to compile.
right.
Okay, that's great. And then secondly, so I have X16 currently. I got the
Mhm,
notice about X17. Is
mhm.
X17 generally available or is it still beta?
Yeah, so that's in a beta format. And so we'll typically do that for probably mid-June. And
Okay.
then approximately around that time, we'll release it as our final release
Okay.
for general use. If you're a current customer, you can go get the beta. You can um, download that from your digital locker, and then you'll have access to the tools that we've been showing in today's session.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Bonnie, for calling in.
Scott, we have a question from David Carr. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, this is Dave.
Hey, Dave.
I'm in Tahiti on vacation, so
Really?
yeah.
And you're calling in on vacation?
Well,
Oh,
this was
okay.
something. So
I wish I were there to answer your question live, but go ahead, Dave.
well, it's just a plane fare away.
Yeah.
Anyway, so can you explain how? Because you mentioned importing a panoramic view for the backdrop.
Right.
All right. So how do I sync that with North? Because you were.
Yeah, so there's a scrubber bar when you bring in the backdrop, and you can slide that around to where you want that to be oriented. I'm not sure I have a good example here. If I were to take a 3D view, point in here, let's see. I'm not sure if I have a good panoramic picture. It's difficult to get a good panoramic picture because if you've got a structure, it's difficult to get one that goes 360. So I'll usually get one that goes about 180 and put that into the background. And let's see if I have one handy here. User catalog, backdrops. Let's see. Trying to see if I have one handy here. Well, I don't know if I do. Does any chief staffer out there know where I can get a quick panoramic backdrop to show? Anybody? My backdrops. Let's see if I've got one in there. See if that one's panoramic. That is not. So there's a setting. Let's see if I have one in HDRI. HD. Oh, go ahead.
One of our users says maybe HDRI.
Yeah, that's what I just found here. So I'm going to grab one of the HDRI backdrops and drag that in to the scene here. So just click and place that into the scene. So it's a little bit dark based on what's going on. And then underneath of the settings here, somebody may need to point me to where, okay. So what I've done here, Dave, is I opened up the camera settings, right? Edit view. Are you following there?
Yes.
Okay, so edit view, and then down where it's those HDRI backdrops are already marked as spherical. And so there's a couple of settings in here that you can modify. So there's a horizontal offset and a vertical offset as well. So if I start to move this around, there's not a lot of variation in this picture per se, other than it's pretty bright on one side. So I can start to move that around, and you see in the 3D view how that's moving it around.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. So
There are controls. I believe that's about the best level I can do, but there's several controls down here, the eye level, if you need to raise that up a little bit. And I believe there's also a video. I'm pretty sure there's a video on that, but I'm not positive.
All right.
And so these are the best controls you can use to try to get that. As far as setting it exact north, you're probably more knowledgeable about that than I would be after you figure out how to slide that around.
All right. Yeah, I mean, the way I would do it is I'd figure out where true north is and then have a pointer. In other words, have some type of, I'm looking at an empty lot right now, okay?
Yeah,
So
right.
where is true north? And then I would indicate that's where I want to be. And then I'd come to here, find true north, and then set up the backdrop and then move it until my true north lines up.
Yeah, good. Sounds like a nice option. You can get that planned up while you're on vacation.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, hey, thanks for calling in.
No problem.
Carrie?
Yep, we have a question from Alan Williams. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, let's check in with David Kozub. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey Scott, how you doing?
Hey, good. How are you, Alan? Where are you
I'm
calling
good.
from?
South Carolina.
Okay.
Quick question. Whenever I set up my cameras and I do all like the ray tracing and the physically based, and I like to set them up prior to, and I want to use that camera setting for the walkthroughs. Is there any way to do that? Where I just, I set it up prior to and then just set my path and it literally has all the cameras where I don't have to go back and set them up through the walkthrough viewpoint.
Okay, so if I understand your question right, Alan, you want to take your camera that you've already got dialed in and copy those settings into the walkthrough camera?
Yeah, yes.
So the one you can do that with is on this spherical one, right? So you take
Okay.
a 3D view, dial in your 3D view, and then you convert that to a spherical walkthrough. Now, if you, let me just open up my camera variation here and click on this. Now, when I open up a camera that's already got the settings, and this is not going to be spherical, so this is just going to be maybe a straight perspective camera looking straight in, then, and I think I mentioned this in the session, usually what I'll do is I'll generate this camera and I'll dial in the sun settings. And also, if I want line drawing on, there's all kinds of settings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's not really a great way to just say, okay, well, now make that a walkthrough path and derive it from those camera settings. So what I end up doing is once I get this camera is I'll open up the edit active view, and on the camera itself, make sure the sun information that I got here, because this sunlight, is probably using a generic sunlight and the tilt angle in there. So there's a few of those things. And then when you click the define on the camera, I can usually have that set up in the camera itself for the walkthrough default. So not a lot, except a few of these things if you want hand drawn lines on top. So that's probably the best that I can offer to you, but we'll make a note that it would be nice to say, hey, I have a 3D camera open. There's some settings that I've already dialed in, and boy, it'd be nice to press a button and transfer those over. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's definitely accurate. It's kind of the direction that I was hoping for. Is almost like the same way we have light sets, almost have it as a camera set and say, oh, hey, camera one, use those settings in camera one for my walkthrough. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Because that was the issue. That's exactly how I would do it, and that's the issues I ran into. Is like, after I set it up, I just took screenshots and punched in all the exact same numbers, and it was pretty quick. But I was just wondering if I can just click and like have it as a default for my camera walkthrough cameras as well.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's my only question. Thank you again. This was awesome.
Okay.
Really excited about
Thanks,
Xtreme.
Alan. Yep.
So our next question is from Alan Williams. Go ahead and ask your question, Alan.
Can you hear me okay?
Hey, Alan, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Kennewick, Washington,
Oh,
just south of
okay.
you over here.
Sure,
My
I know
question
where
is
that's at.
about, my question is about delivering this to the customer. Does it need to be posted on the cloud site with an access code, or can you send it as an email so they can view it on an iPad for
Sure.
anyone?
Sure. So when you go and you record your walkthrough, let me close this up. Well, let's open up one of these walkthrough paths. Let me switch back over. A lot of noise on here. So when I go to record one of these walkthroughs, there's an option here to include it on the Chief Architect cloud account. That's your cloud account, right?
Yeah.
And so when you put it up on the cloud, you can use that sharing mechanism. Let's see if I have that handy. Gosh, a lot of stuff.
So based on size, that's the best way to give them access?
Right. Well, that's a way to give them access, right? You can send them the share code and or you could email it to them if you put it on your disk, or you could put it on your, YouTube account and send them a YouTube link. So, several different options. You can take this. I was just looking to see if I have that share information. Nope, I don't have it handy. Let me see if I can open that up here. Accounts, here we go.
They'll
Okay.
probably.
So I've opened up my share account here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this happens to be panoramic images, but it's the same thing. So once you've put it up on your cloud account and you've gone into your account, there's a share option here. And when you click the share option, you can send the link, you can email it to somebody so they can actually watch it. And so you don't, a lot of those videos can be pretty large, and putting in an email, embedding in an email is, not easy. So you could grab the email, they can view it, and because it's hosted on your cloud account through Chief Architect, then they can watch it, and you don't have to necessarily be a YouTuber and put it up on your YouTube account. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And there's no, any other option, can they make comments and send them back, or do they got to do that as a separate document?
Yeah, what they would do is they'd reply to your email and say, why is the sun so bright or something?
Okay.
Why is this such a great design?
Yeah. And this works pretty good with iPads?
Should. Yeah.
Okay.
As long as, the person has enough screen real estate on the device. I know people have done it on their phones, so that works as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for calling in, Alan.
So do you have time for 2 more questions?
Now let's do 2 more and then we'll do a closure. If there happens to be many more after that, then after that closure, we can probably come back on. So let's take 2 more.
Okay, our next question is from Mark. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, Scott.
Hey, Mark.
I have gotten really through. I love the HDRI images, and when you do the sun studies with these new time-lapse features, is there any way to get the sun in the HDR images to follow through on that? And then in 3D views, can you use the Move Sun tool to adjust the location of the light? But you will not see an actual representation of the sun unless you are generating the backdrop. So you showed the sun going through the sky in one of yours. It actually,
right.
You can see that ball. I don't know how you do that. And Can we match that up with HDRI?
Yeah.
Can you get HDRI to align with the sun angle?
Right. So let me just show for the purpose of that here, the front. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit slow, but I'll pause it when the sun starts to come in here. There we go. So I'll just pause that. Sun's going to pop in, and then So I'll just move that a little bit. So the sun's moving down, right? Was that the part you were referring to, how the sun's moving across the sky?
And so can I make that accurate to where it's aligned with my sun angle?
Well, that should be your sun angle, because what I've done with that setting, let me open that back up. Gosh, a lot of stuff opened. Kill that. So that, let me go back into my cameras. Gosh, a lot of stuff open here. Sorry about that.
Hey, Scott.
Were you using a HDRI background for that?
No, actually not. So if I grab that front overview, and let's just open it up. So here's that camera that you were looking at. And so it's saying use sunlight, right?
Right.
When you click on adjust sunlight, that one's not the one I wanted. Let's try that one. Okay. So I've got a sun angle in here, and that's at, 5:15 a.m. So it's going to start super early, and then it's going to, fade down in when I do the time lapse and set it up. And when you have set up your north pointer and your latitude and longitude, right? You know how to do that?
Yeah, I know how to do that. That's
okay.
Good.
So when you've set up your north pointer and your latitude and longitude, we know the coordinates of where your structure is, and assuming you've put that correctly on the plan, and I've done that down here for the benefit of let's go switch over to the site plan here. So I've done all these sun angles, right? And my north pointer is angled here. So when I run that time lapse, it's going to be using the coordinates and the if you started your time lapse at 10 a.m. and run it to 9 p.m., then it's going to be using that information. These individual let's just open up one of these. You can also, you probably wouldn't do it, but here's where your latitude and longitude information is. It's being defined in the defaults for the plan, right?
Yeah, and I use it from, Google Maps or whatever.
Yeah, sure. So once you have that information in there, now your other part of your question was, that's going to move the sun, okay? But to have that also, if you had an HDRI backdrop, the two are disconnected, so that's not going to change the backdrop per se. And I may just pause here and see if any one of the chief staffers that know a lot more about that than I do want to weigh in.
That light source is set in the image, right? It doesn't move.
Right. Yeah, and you can also set, when you're in your rendering, to exclusively use the light source from that HDRI backdrop, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so there's an option.
I wasn't aware of that, so I can turn that.
No, there's an option in there in your camera. I've still got this camera open. If we go into the light information and we go into where is that backdrop? Somebody point me to this. Only use lighting from the backdrop. Somebody point me to that.
It should be in your rendering techniques.
Okay, underneath the camera. Oh, it's probably only physically based, right? Yeah, there it is. So that's only going to work with cameras that support that. And in this case, Mark, do you see this setting here that says only use backdrop for lighting? So that's going to switch that over, and then the lighting is going to be coming from that backdrop from the external source. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but that won't change unless you physically rotate it.
I'm not going to be able to get a stationary walkthrough that's going to move there's a simulated sun in that backdrop. It's not going to necessarily move that light when I do the stationary walkthrough. And I'll just pause. Trent, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so your backdrop is just a static image. If you have the checkbox unchecked so that sun is not just coming from the backdrop and it's actually coming from the defined sun that you've set up in your walkthrough, it will change lighting and it'll change where the shadows are going to come down, but your backdrop will stay the same throughout that walkthrough.
Oh, so when you uncheck that, it's actually kind of showing like there's still a sun in the clouds, for instance, but it won't move. But your shadows and stuff will move with your sun setting.
Yeah, if you have by default where the backdrop is not the only thing contributing to the scene lighting, your sun defined in the plan will still be the main source of light.
Okay. Okay. I think I've got enough information to play around with it and figure it out. Knowing where to turn that off was definitely helpful, Scott.
Okay. Well, thanks for calling in, Mark. So we've got time for one more question. As I said, I'll do kind of a close if there happens to be a few more pop up after that, but I want to go through a few closing remarks. Carrie, let's take one more question out there.
All right, our last question is from Sean. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hey Scott, I'm Sean from Indiana. How you doing?
Hey Sean from Indiana, thanks for calling in.
Yeah, man. I'm wondering, so on the sun setting, do you have to do like a rendered out video to study the sun, or can you do it kind of like live action for your own design purposes?
I'm going to have you repeat that one more time so I
yeah,
better
it's kind of hard
understand.
to word. So like, I mean, the rendering out a video for the client's great, but when I'm just designing, you know, just kind of studying the sun myself, do I have to render out a video, or can I do that in like a live view?
Oh yeah, so if you want to just do a live view, right? So we've got this view up here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I want to modify this view and say, well, gosh, what would this look like? Let's see what our sun information is, adjust sunlight here. And we want to say use a specific sun angle, and we'll use something that is a little bit more in the middle of the day. So maybe 10 a.m., right? So I'm going to set that to be 10 a.m. and I think I have to go back into my backdrop and say get more light than just the backdrop. So let me go back in and uncheck that backdrop for lighting. Okay, so I've set this sun angle to be at 10 a.m. on July 4th, and so I'm not seeing maybe a lot of sun in here, so maybe that's just the way it is in this view. I could rotate around and see if it's on the other side. Let's see if I can rotate around. You know, so it's still pretty early.
You can't have that like time lapse effect of it going throughout the whole day without doing a stationary video.
Well, it's pretty easy to do. Let's zoom out, right? And you know, at this point, I can just click the time lapse option right here. So it's create stationary time lapse, right? And so then I can come in and choose, you know, when's it going to start, 6 p.m. and when's it going to end, you know, 9:30 p.m. and then set up the settings. It takes a little while to run.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's going to go ahead and crank up and start doing that time lapse. So that is going to be a moving file, MP4, something like that, right? And then I'm going to have that file. It's not necessarily, you know, a live render. You know, it's going to take a while to record this, right? So it's going to chunk through, and depending on, you know, the duration and frames per second and all those things, it's going to, you know, go through and process this.
Set those fairly low so you could get a quick video just to check.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
You set it to be 5 frames per second. I know the engineering team's been working on speeding this up significantly, so we may have you know, an option there that goes really pretty fast. But that's how you do it. That's how you're going to get your live action with your you know, your camera. That's as live as we can get it. Is take your 3D view, hit the time lapse, choose the start time, end time, and then kick it off.
Okay.
Hey, Scott,
Yeah.
Derek
Yeah.
here. Something that might help Sean there, it sounded like he might have been asking about being in a 3D view and just moving the sun, so animating the sun using the Moves Sun tool. And that kind of can show you in a static 3D view the sun kind of going from high in the sky to a sunset with the generated sky turned on.
And would that stay in your coordinates, or would that change your coordinates?
No, it would alter how the shadows look there, so it wouldn't
Okay.
take into account the seasonality and longitude and latitude.
Okay.
I think what Derek's talking about is if I override the sun angle and we
Right.
come in to the sun, and I force it to be turned off, and then let's grab that sun, click. So, you see the sun angle, how I can kind of move it, but I'm moving it free willy, right?
Right.
And so it's not staying on any sort of a tangent or any coordinate line as I move that sun angle around. However, it is fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay,
I call it the sun's always bright in my world. Thanks for calling in, Sean.
Can I jump
So
in
if
real
you,
quick, Scott?
oh yeah, go ahead.
So one thing that you could do is create a normal walkthrough path and put the start and end keyframes close to each other, and then you could set the sun angle on the start and the end at different times, like where you want to do your kind of sun study, and you can actually look in the walkthrough preview panel and scrub through that, and it'll take into account your latitude and longitude and the times that you've set in, but it's not as, it won't take as long as actually recording the whole walkthrough.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right, thanks, Sean. So let's talk about a few closing things. Appreciate everybody coming. We're recording the session. We'll send that recording out in the next day or so. And we would appreciate, there's a link to a survey there, feedback you could offer us to improve these. We're doing these sessions on kind of focusing on the new features in X17 every week. And as I kind of scroll down our events page here, next week, same time, same place, we are going to be talking about custom tiles and materials. There's a new material builder built into the program. It's kind of nice. You can click on a backsplash or a shower material and move that in a perspective 3D view. So it's kind of nice if you're trying to align your tile and get a certain look, rotate the tile, and then the material builder as well allows you to create your own tile and change your grout color, change the look of that. You can create pretty much most manufacturer tiles if you wanted to even use a seed image and pull that in. So it's pretty nice. So we'll have one of the main developers of that kind of going through how that tool works. So it'll be a great if you're an interior designer or a kitchen and bath person, or for that matter, you just like to make sure that your materials look great. That's a nice tool to see. That's next Thursday here at noon. And then a few more. We've got a specific one on rendering, lighting. That'll be the week after, 3D dimensions and text, and then our productivity tools. And then just kind of a few high points about our events coming up. Our big event of the year is called the Chief Academy. So that's training, social events. It's 2 days of training, half-day lab where we focus on your projects and or lab projects from the class, and do a lot of social activities around lake cruise, river receptions, those kinds of things. And if you got a chance to come to Coeur d'Alene, it's pretty nice here in the summer. And then we do on-demand training. Those are free. We do one-on-one training if you need a little help. And then if you're new-ish to the program, a residential boot camp, there's one tomorrow at 10 a.m. So that's nice. It's free. And if you're just kind of new to the program, then that's a nice way to learn. And then we repeat that next Friday, kitchen and baths, if you're more interior related. Same type of thing if you're new to the program and do those sorts of things. So I want to thank everybody for coming to today's event. have a great day, and hopefully we will see you back here in the near future. Have a great day.